What's up, everybody? Welcome back to part 5 of my videos of going over Kathleen Zellner's newest filing on behalf of Steven Avery in an attempt to get him an evidentiary hearing, and we're going to pick right up where we left off. This part we're going to start out with the state's opportunity argument. According to the trial court, Mr. Avery's trial defense counsel already established that Bobby Dassey had the opportunity to commit the murder of Teresa Halbach by his mere presence at the Avery salvage yard on October 31st, 2005. Now the state wants to place an additional burden on Steven Avery, relying on Kansas and not Wisconsin law. The state admits that under Wisconsin law, opportunity can be established by simply showing the third party was at the crime scene. However, the state contends that in order to meet the opportunity prong, Steven Avery has to offer evidence that the alleged third-party perpetrator had the skills, contacts, tools, time, and or other means necessary to have committed the crime and staged the crime scene in the manner the defendant alleges. There is no such requirement in Wisconsin law, which states in much more general terms that it is sufficient to demonstrate evidence that the third party had the realistic ability to engineer such a scenario. The state concludes that Steven Avery's submissions do not meet the Kansas standard. Mr. Avery's makes absolutely no sense. Steven Avery's case is pending in Wisconsin. He is focused on his submissions meeting the Wisconsin standard, which he has clearly accomplished. The state is baffled as to why Bobby Dassey would want to frame Steven Avery. I'm not even going to read the next part. He would want to frame Steven Avery so that he wouldn't go to jail himself. Let's see what Kathleen Zellner says. The answer is simple. If Steven Avery was not prosecuted for the murder of Teresa Halbach, then Bobby Dassey was the next most likely candidate to be prosecuted for her murder. He was present and observing Teresa Halbach during her visit to this Avery property on October 31st, 2005. Bobby Dassey lied about being asleep from 6:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. Searches were made on the Dassey computer at 7 a.m., 9:33 a.m., 10:09 a.m., 1:08 p.m., 1:51 p.m. prior to Teresa Halbach's arrival at the Avery salvage yard. Bobby Dassey was the only one home during those searches, according to his trial testimony. Bobby was present and awake when Teresa Halbach called and left a voicemail requesting the exact address for the appointment. He was present when Teresa Halbach arrived. He lied about Teresa Halbach walking towards Steven Avery's trailer because he saw her leave the property at the same time he left the property. He lied about going hunting and passing Scott Taddock at 3 p.m., going east in his Blazer when he was seen at 3:30 p.m. driving an unknown vehicle west by his brother Blaine, and a propane driver on the Avery property, which resembled Teresa Halbach's vehicle. Teresa Halbach's RAV4 was seen by witnesses parked at the turnaround about 1.8 miles from the Avery salvage yard in the direction Blaine saw Bobby driving. Bobby had human fingernail scratches on his back that he claimed were from his puppy. Bobby gave false testimony about Steven Avery's alleged remark about disposing of a body. The remark was completely discredited and contradicted by Michael Osmansun. Combined reports, re-interviews of Bobby Dassey, where Bobby never told this to law enforcement. Teresa Halbach's fuel-stained cut large bones were found in the Dassey burn barrel, including a scapula, portions of a spinal column, and fragments of long bones. The state argues that Steven Avery's defense theory has changed dramatically since the trial. However, the state fails to acknowledge that because the court barred introduction of third-party Denny suspects evidence in Steven Avery's trial, obviously prior to the discovery of the violent searches and the Thomas Sawinski evidence, Steven Avery's trial defense counsel did not have the ability to suggest that persons other than law enforcement officers had access to bloody bandages, bloody towels, and blood drips that came from Steven Avery's pre-existing finger injury. Imagine not being allowed to say someone else committed the murder when you believe you can prove it. It's a weird ruling by that judge. In response, that the state claims that Avery offers no reason why Bobby would want to send Avery to prison, and gives its own wild hypotheses of the impossibility of Bobby Dassey's actions to hide his crimes. The state claims, nor has Avery explained why someone who would want to frame him would go to such lengths to hide the evidence. Surely, if Bobby Dassey or anyone else wanted to frame Avery, they wouldn't have gone out of their way to make all the evidence difficult for law enforcement to detect, gather, and connect to Steven Avery. The state claims that by hiding the RAV4 on the Avery property, it led authorities right to Dassey's door. The state's assertion is false. Putting the RAV4 on the Avery property with Steven Avery's blood in it led the police directly to Steven Avery's door. The RAV4 was not carefully hidden because the civilian searcher found it in less than 35 minutes among hundreds of salvage cars. It makes perfect sense, contrary to the state's argument, to burn the victim's remains and personal property and plant them in Mr. Avery's burn pit to frame him. Steven Avery was the only one who had a huge civil rights case pending, $36 million, against Manitowoc County Police, so he became law enforcement's target of choice. The police needed Bobby Dassey to testify against Steven Avery to say that Teresa Halbach went to Steven Avery's trailer, and Bobby needed to testify to exclude himself and make Steven Avery the guilty party. Bobby seized every opportunity to frame Steven Avery, including becoming the state's star witness. The state is incorrect that the evidence was difficult for law enforcement to detect, gather, and connect to Steven Avery. The evidence was blatantly easy for law enforcement to detect immediately after it was planted, such as when Teresa Halbach's RAV4 was suddenly found, coincidentally, at the Avery salvage yard after witnesses observed a vehicle in a different location earlier in the week, or Steven Avery's blood found selectively dripped in the RAV4 and placed on the dash with an applicator. None of Mr. Avery's fingerprints were found on the RAV4. Even though Mr. Avery could have crushed the vehicle in minutes, he allegedly left it in plain sight for several days with the incriminating evidence intact. Only Bobby stayed behind when others living on the property went to the family residence in CRIVITZ the weekend after Teresa Halbach's disappearance. Thus, Bobby Dassey had an easy opportunity to plant evidence against Steven Avery. Teresa Halbach's key magically appeared in Steven Avery's trailer after multiple searches had been made of the trailer without the key being detected. This makes so much sense. The state response is completely devoid of any mention of its theory during Steven Avery's trial. The state's theory of what happened the day Teresa Halbach's murder left many questions unanswered. The state claimed that Steven Avery inexplicitly placed Teresa Halbach's body in the rear cargo area of her RAV4 in his garage and then removed her from the RAV4, laid her on the garage floor and shot her in the left side and back of her head. The state's theory was contrived to explain the presence of Teresa Halbach's blood on the rear cargo door and in the rear cargo area of her vehicle. The state did not have an explanation for how Teresa Halbach's bones were found in multiple locations, when undoubtedly explained why Steven Avery was acquitted of the mutilation charge. I still don't get that. Brendan was found guilty of the mutilation charge, but Steven Avery wasn't. Bizarre. None of this makes any sense. The more likely claim of events was that Teresa Halbach had finished photographing Barb's van, and as she was leaving the Avery salvage yard, Bobby followed her, flagged her down, and attacked her. He placed her body in the back of the RAV4, drove back to the Avery salvage yard, drove into his garage, shot her in the head, dismembered her body, placed her body in one of the Dassey burn barrels, and transported it to the quarry where he burned it, inadvertently spilling bones on the ground, and then he brought the bones back to the Avery salvage yard and tipped them into Steven Avery's burn pit. The theory that Bobby Dassey returned to the Avery salvage yard with Teresa Halbach in the cargo area of her vehicle is corroborated by the fact that the propane driver saw a similar vehicle to Teresa Halbach's drive past him exiting the Avery salvage yard, and Blaine and Bobby saw a greenish blue colored vehicle on STH 147 in the opposite direction that Bobby testified he was driving. Both witnesses making these observations around 3:30 p.m. on October 31st, 2005. The RAV4 was dumped about 1.8 miles west of the Avery property, where Kevin Romlow, RAHMLOW, spotted it on November 3rd. The state argues that Avery has offered no facts at all that would establish how Bobby Dassey, an 18-year-old high school graduate with no criminal record whatsoever, who was working third shift at a furniture factory, could have executed the state's list of events that it argues had occurred in the murder of Teresa Halbach. That's what all those internet searches were for. The state offered no facts to establish how Steven Avery, a high school dropout whose experience consisted of serving 18 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, suddenly decided to murder Teresa Halbach and forego the millions of dollars he stood to obtain from the state and his civil rights lawsuit. Only after an evidentiary hearing is the court charged with determining the issue and making findings of fact and conclusions of law. The state claims that Steven Avery has the burden of demonstrating the following points, which is contrary to Wisconsin case law. But regardless, Steven Avery responds to each of the state's allegations concerning its claim that Steven Avery had offered no facts at all that would establish how Bobby Dassey, an 18-year-old high school graduate with no criminal record whatsoever and who was working third shift at a furniture factory, as follows. The state's response: managed to steal at some unidentified time prior to October 31st the rifle hanging above Avery's bed, which the victim was shot, and at some other unidentified time before November 5th managed to replace it, with Avery never noticing. Steven Avery's reply: the bullets from Steven Avery's garage and surrounding property were the result of target shooting around Steven Avery's garage over a long period of time. All these bullets would have matched Mr. Avery's rifle. The bullet with Teresa Halbach's DNA on it was planted by the killer. The bullet had similar to red paint, like the red paint on Avery's garage, and never went through the skull or any parts of Teresa Halbach's skeleton. The real killer had access to Teresa Halbach's DNA and could have easily planted it on the bullet in Avery's garage. State's response: could have abducted and killed the victim and hidden both her body and her car in some unknown area in the minutes between her arrival on the property and Scott Taddock passing Bobby Dassey on the highway around 3 p.m. on October 31st, 2005. Nor has Avery provided any facts to establish where the killing could have happened apart from a nondescript, or where Bobby could have hidden the RAV4 and the victim's remains in this short period of time. Steven Avery's reply: Steven Avery would challenge the credibility of Scott Taddock and his timeline at an evidentiary hearing. Scott Taddock's testimony directly contradicts the testimony of Blaine, who saw Bobby traveling the opposite direction. Mr. Taddock would be impeached on a number of other issues at an evidentiary hearing, including but not limited to his earlier timeline for his whereabouts on October 31st, 2005, and his efforts to sell Bobby's .22 caliber rifle after the murder. State's response: had the scientific sophistication and knowledge necessary for it to occur to Bobby to collect, transport, and plant Steven Avery's blood from his sink, and as Avery has completely overlooked his non-blood touch DNA on the hood latch of the victim's RAV4 and her keys, or how Bobby acquired the skills to do so successfully. He looked them up. Bobby could have easily removed the blood from Mr. Avery's sink by using a wet sponge or rag and dripping it onto the RAV4 when it was in his possession. He could have applied the blood smear on the dash with any type of Q-tip-like object from the Avery salvage yard. The touch DNA on the hood latch was planted by the police by substaining the groin swab, which was illegally taken from Steven Avery. Even if that theory was discounted, Bobby Dassey still had access to Steven Avery's DNA by having access to his trailer, so he could have used Steven Avery's toothbrush to plant his DNA on the hood latch. Bobby had to touch the hood latch to disconnect the battery, and he undoubtedly wore gloves, or perhaps the idea of planting Steven Avery's DNA came to him as a result of that activity. Perhaps his 3 searches for DNA on the Dassey computer gave him that idea. Response: the convenient stash of unidentified instruments capable of collecting and transporting liquid blood on hand, or what those might have been. Avery's reply: the only instrument necessary to transport blood would have been a sponge or rag. State response: planted the keys to the RAV4 in Avery's trailer unnoticed at some specific time between November 3rd and November 5th, yet also either managed to move the RAV4 off the 40-acre property without the keys, or drive it away and return on foot from wherever he supposedly took it, and then sneak it into Avery's trailer again to hide the keys at some other unidentified time, once again unnoticed. Steven Avery's reply: Bobby had the vehicle key when he drove the RAV4 to its location at State Highway 147 on Monday, October 31st, and Friday, November 4th, when he moved it back onto the Avery salvage yard. He planted the key in Steven Avery's bedroom after removing Teresa Halbach's DNA from it and putting Steven Avery's DNA on it. Many items from Steven Avery's trailer could have been the source of his DNA, including Steven Avery's toothbrush. The key was not discovered until November 8th. Bobby was alone on the property after the family left on November 4th and early on November 5th, until the police blocked off access to the property when Teresa Halbach's vehicle was discovered around noon. State response: 6. Found and then planted a tiny mangled bullet fragment that Bobby inexplicitly knew had the victim's DNA on it underneath items in Avery's garage, or alternatively, how he shot the victim in Avery's garage on October 31st, and then at another unidentified time scrubbed the scene, with Avery remaining unaware of this, despite Steven Avery's indisputably having been working on his Suzuki and other vehicles in and around the garage around this time. Steven Avery's response: Bobby had access to Teresa Halbach's blood if he killed her, and could have simply put the blood on one of the dozen bullets in and around Steven Avery's garage. There was no proof that Teresa Halbach was shot in Steven Avery's garage. There is no DNA of Teresa Halbach in Steven Avery's garage. There is no blood splatter in Steven Avery's garage or on Steven Avery's rifle. There is no evidence that the crime ever occurred in Steven Avery's garage. State response: number 7. Burned the victim's body in some undisclosed location and then moved the remains to the Avery burn pit, again completely undetected, and did so thoroughly as to include at least a fragment or more of almost every bone below the neck, the entire human skeleton, along with the rivets from her jeans. Nor has Avery provided any facts showing where and when this occurred. Steven Avery's reply: Mr. Avery was acquitted of burning Teresa Halbach's body. Teresa Halbach's body was not burned in Steven Avery's burn pit, but was burned in the Dassey burn barrel, which contained Teresa Halbach's bone fragments, which had cut marks and smelled of flammable liquid. Only 40% of Teresa Halbach's bones were discovered, and her bone fragments were found in the quarry, suggesting that she was burned in the Dassey burn barrel in the quarry and transported back to the Avery salvage yard, where the bones were dumped in Steven Avery's burn pit. State response: 8. Convinced his younger brother Brendan to go along with his plan and fabricate a confession implicating himself and Avery, or why Brendan would do so. Steven Avery's response: it was not Bobby who coached Brendan, it was the police, as Brendan's interrogation video indicates. The police fed him the entire story to frame Steven Avery. After the state improperly alleges that Steven Avery must address all of its speculative theories, it also claims that Bobby would have needed to take action in roughly half an hour because Steven Avery's blood would have coagulated. State, without any expert to support this assertion, claims that Steven Avery's blood would have coagulated in half an hour. Even so, if it is Steven Avery's theory that the RAV4 was parked 1.8 miles from the Avery salvage yard at the turnaround by the bridge at STH 147, driving 30 miles an hour. It would have taken Bobby 3 minutes and 36 seconds to reach the RAV4, which would leave 20 minutes and 24 seconds to plant Steven Avery's blood. Additionally, Bobby could have used a water-infused sponge to collect the blood from Steven Avery's sink, which would have slowed the coagulation process without affecting the DNA profile of Steven Avery. The internet search for blood on the Dassey computer could have revealed that the addition of water to blood slows or stops the coagulation process. All right, that's where I'm going to end this part. I'll be back with the next one shortly. Let me know what you think. Leave some comments below. I hope you're having a good day, and I'll see you again soon.